And in the second hour, we turn to Charles Murray, an old and treasured friend and one of the sharpest socio-political observers that I know, and certainly one of the best when it comes to writing book-length treatises dealing with the modern dilemma in which we find ourselves. Among his many books, he's well known for The Bell Curve, for Losing Ground, most recently for Coming Apart, until very recently, the publication of his new book, By the People, subtitled Rebuilding Liberty Without Permission. Charles, thank you so much for joining us today.
Milt, it's always a great pleasure to be talking to you.
Now, the subtitle, Rebuilding Liberty Without Permission. If I have to rebuild liberty, somebody's taking it away from me. Who and why?
Governments at several levels, Milt, federal, state, and local. But what I'm focusing on in this book is the federal government, more specifically the regulatory state, and the gravamen of my argument is that the regulatory state is unwarrantedly interfering in serious ways with the ability of ordinary Americans to live their lives as they see fit. And I want to do something about it.
Well, they did that to me just today. I sent an old-fashioned letter, a snail mail letter, to someone about something, and for that I had to put on a stamp for it to be delivered. That's the state interfering, but they've been doing that for rather a long time.
No, now, Milt, as a good libertarian, I say they are providing a service which, in your view, is worth paying for, just as when you go out to buy a loaf of bread, you think the loaf of bread is worth more than the price you pay for it. So, nope, that's not what I have in mind.
What do you have in mind?
Let me give you an example, which is, let's say you're a small factory owner.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there is a regulation in OSHA's books which says you should have railings on open stairwells. Well, that is a regulation that has a rationale. You don't want people falling off stairwells. I have no objection to the existence of the regulation. But the regulation also stipulates that the railings are to be 42 inches high. Okay.
Must be 42 inches high. What if they're 41?
Well, then you have to replace all your railings at a cost of several $1,000s.
Uh-huh.
See, this is what I mean. It's not that I'm against all regulation. On the contrary, to have regulations that keep chimneys from belching noxious smoke is in defense of a classic public good that even the strictest opponent of expansive government like me says, no, this is a legitimate function of government. Similarly, I'm in favor of regulations to keep people from falling off stairwells. What I'm not in favor of are bureaucrats mindlessly enforcing these thousands of regulations in ways which force people to spend money, time, effort, complying when they have not done anything wrong.
I'll tell you one regulation that rather scares me. It's showing up in various forms, both in state governments and localities, but also I think at the federal level, and that is rules or laws or judicial judgments against, quote, hate speech, which may well work to inhibit me from speaking my true mind about something that I disapprove of.
Well, actually, given your profession, Milt, it could make you a lawbreaker.
Yes.
And given some of the ways that some universities are defining hate speech, some of them would say, "Oh, the bell curve was hate speech."
Yeah.
It wasn't.
They did say that about you. They called you. They called you racist for that book.
Yeah, and it's one thing to say, "Oh, I could go into a reasonable court and defend every sentence in the book,"
and probably sue. You could probably sue for libel, actually.
Yeah. Well, I shouldn't have to do that. You know, it's the idea of having laws against hate speech is precisely the kind of thing that the American experiment said couldn't be done. That we could say what we wanted if we didn't shout fire in a crowded theater.
Well, now, you know, I've been for some years a member of the board of an organization with which I'm sure you're familiar, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, the acronym being FIRE. And they're very concerned with restrictions put on both students and professors in universities and colleges for limiting their speech, either because it's implicitly or explicitly hate speech as viewed by some bureaucrat within the administration, or maybe even somebody complaining from beyond the administration, from government to the administration, which in turn regulates and restricts the utterances of this or that professor.
You know, in bringing this up, you are making me rethink one of the common things I've been saying in lectures about the new book. Because one of my points has been that actually people like me still can live our lives as we see fit, which in my view is what the American idea of freedom was all about.
You are a fellow, one should make clear, of the American Enterprise Institute, and they fully commission you to do what you want to do and say what you want to say.
They pay me a salary to say what I want to say.
Yeah.
And insofar as there are government regulations that affect my employment, AEI has a department that takes care of that kind of stuff. I am buffered from most of the regulatory state, but you just made me realize that with the hate speech stuff, that's a cloud on the horizon that could develop into a storm. So even somebody like me is not necessarily always going to be free from this kind of interference. I guess my larger point, Milt, in this regard is there is a difficulty of those who are buffered from these rules and regulations to empathize with the small business person, with the homeowner who wants to improve his property, or the farmer who wants to improve his property. It's hard for us to empathize with the degree to which they are unable to do things that are important in their lives because of senseless, pointless, tyrannical regulatory interference.
The fellow who reviewed your book for the Washington Post, his name is Carlos Lozada, says of you, he not only offers a bleak assessment of the health of American democracy, but and here is where things get interesting, he calls for civil disobedience aimed at rehabilitating it. And he goes on to say, if Atlas Shrugged had been written by a despondent social scientist instead of a dyspeptic novelist, it would read a lot like By the People.
Milt, I do need to come on your show to hear what the reviews say, because I don't read them. But I have to say that's a great line.
Is it true? Is it in some sense appropriate? Are you as dyspeptic towards...
Yeah, you know what?
Yeah.
You know what? The anger that is apparent in Atlas Shrugged towards certain kinds of government activities is mirrored in my own genuine anger at what's going on. Can I tell you quickly the story about how I wrote the book?
Of course, please do.
We have a friend who runs a business that employs Latinos. And like many businesses do, but unlike most people in his line of work, he documents them. So everybody is here legally. He spends $20,000 to $30,000 a year getting visas and all that. But he's made himself a visible target, and so he has been harassed relentlessly for the most arcane violations. Here's one for you. A visa has an entry date and an exit date. You and I say, well, I can't come in before the entry date, and I can leave any time I want to before the exit date. One of his employees had to go home a few days early because his father was dying, and this guy paid $5,700 in fines. Don't ask me the details of why, but there is in all of this, no, he was supposed to go home on the date on his visa, not before it. Okay. Anyway, he on one of these violations that had been driving him nuts, he said to the bureaucrat, I'm going to fight this in court. And the bureaucrat responded, you try that and we'll put you out of business.
Really?
And my friend knew that was true. And I bet if you talk to your friends who are small business people, they have had similar things happen to that.
And so he backed off and paid the fine?
Oh, yeah, and that's the way the regulatory state works with small with individual homeowners and small business people. They don't have to actually prove anything. They don't have people cave. They don't have a choice but to cave. You can't fight the federal government if you're a lone person with ordinary resources. They can put you out of business. Well, my reaction to that was every bit as emotional and as infuriated as anything that Ayn Rand ever felt when she was writing Atlas Shrugged. And it was at that point, when I was so infuriated, that I got the idea for a legal defense fund. And then I said to myself, Milt, Charles, you write books. And I said, I'm going to write a book. And that's what happened.
Yes, you write a book advocating, among many other things, the establishment of something which you are calling the Madison Fund.
Mm-hmm. And this would, because in my fury, when I heard this story, I suddenly had an image of a guy in a pinstripe suit who appears out of nowhere, taps this arrogant bureaucrat on the shoulder, and says, we are taking this man's case. We are going to litigate it to the max. You will be sick of us. We're going to pay all of the legal costs. He won't be out a penny. And if you fine him at the end, we're going to reimburse his fine. No kidding, Milt. That came into my head, and all at once I said to myself, this could work. And thereupon was the start of the book.
Well, I do tend to read some of the critical articles about particular books, particularly if they're books that interest me and seem worthy of serious attention, as everything you write certainly does. And there are some reviewing your book, and sometimes even with some hostility from the left, who say that you are really applying the Scientology tactic to make things hot for the government and get them to relent when they try to restrict some of our liberties. Scientology, for the following reason. Scientology was famous for suing everybody all the time as a way of shutting up their critics. They would just decide, oh, well, it isn't worth all that litigation, all that cost. Let's just get these people off our back and we'll go along with it. And no more will we write any critical or amused commentaries on this pseudo-religion called Scientology.
Well, you know what else they did? And this is more directly relevant. They wanted tax-exempt status.
Yes, so they did as a religion, yes.
And so they were suing the IRS. They were suing individual agents within the IRS. They were suing everybody else. Now, I should specify that my legal defense funds are not aggressively going after the government in that kind of way. They are quite the contrary. When the government aggressively comes after ordinary citizens for silly, pointless reasons, it's a way to fight back. It's a very different outlook. However, without allying myself in Scientology in any way, what they did with a very powerful agency brought that agency to its knees. The agency caved. And I hold that up as an example of an analogy I use in the book. The federal government is in many ways like the Wizard of Oz. You remember the movie?
Yes,
it has this booming voice that is very scary. And indeed, the federal government, when it comes after any one of us, is really, really scary. But at the end of the movie, the curtain is pulled aside, and you have this little old man with a pot belly who is not at all fearsome. Well, the federal government's tens of thousands of regulations and laws cannot be enforced by the federal government unless there is massive voluntary compliance. And it does not have the enforcement capabilities to go after widespread number of people who aren't obeying them. So in that sense, I want to expose the weaknesses of the federal government. And, Milt, I'm going to sound more like a radical than I ever have with you, I think. I want people to understand the extent to which the federal government has become a thing apart from the American people.
Well, we need to look at the particular sectors of the American government who most fully give you that sense of offense and of injury and make you most worried about the future of our democracy, the future of our liberty. And I assume that we can go directly to that, looking at particular major sectors of the government, major cabinet offices, so to speak, and the millions or the thousands who work for each of the cabinet officers and see what they're doing to us and what we can do about it through the Madison Fund or other social inventions like that. We'll pursue all of that right after this. And directly back to Charles Murray as we continue to draw from his very important new book, By the People, Rebuilding Liberty Without Permission. As far as I'm concerned, and I think you will agree, the single most pertinent sector of our Constitution is the First Amendment, which does various things, but certainly also guarantees to all of us who live in this country freedom of opinion, and beyond that, freedom of expression of those opinions. Therefore, constraint of our liberty is usually to be found in tampering with and reducing the potency of the First Amendment. You say various federal agencies are doing that injury to us. Apart from the IRS, which others are doing that to us?
Well, let's take some of the areas in which I think we need to subject the regulations to strict scrutiny and see which agencies are involved. Here's one: regulations that prohibit owners of land from doing whatever they wish with it.
Mm-hmm.
Those regulations are subject to strict scrutiny. By the way, I don't mean that people should be allowed to have polluting, things on their land. I go back to my point that if you do something with your land that has an effect on people outside it, then of course it becomes a public good issue. But otherwise, as long as it doesn't do anything to people outside the land, the Fish and Wildlife Service, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, all of those have hundreds, if not thousands, of regulations that prevent people from doing what they wish with their land, even though it does not have any adverse consequences for people abroad. Another big category is regulations that prescribe best practice in a craft or profession. Physicians. You go to any physician and they will tell you of the myriad ways in which they are unable to provide the best patient care they can because of the time, effort, expense, and sometimes because of the counterproductiveness of the regulatory regimes under which they live.
What would be an example of that?
Well, you'd be better off going to a physician to get a specific example of that. I will tell you one that's obvious to everyone who has recently gone to visit a physician, which is that they now have an assistant who goes with them carrying an iPad because the reporting requirements that were part of the Affordable Care Act are so onerous that the physician can't do that by himself, and furthermore, even with the assistant, the amount of time that is eaten up meeting these reporting requirements cut deeply into the time that the physician actually spends in patient care.
A doctor said to me within the last year, I was there just for a general overview, he said, these days I don't talk to my patients, I talk to my computer. Because he's filling out whatever questionnaires are required for each visit, even as he's doing the visit.
Milt, this is a case where I really want people who are in positions where they aren't harassed to try to understand what it means. I mean, if your first reaction is, well, so what if it takes a few extra minutes for them to do that? Wait a minute. Think about what you love to do, and you love to do it 8 hours a day, and it's what you're good at, and it's what is useful, and somebody just says, oh, for 2 of those hours every day, I'm going to make you do stuff that's pointless. That would be a major effect on your quality of life, on the practice of your vocation. And this kind of thing goes on all the time.
It's going to cut down on the amount of time I could actually give to serious conversation with the patient.
Yeah. It's as if we had to spend 12 minutes out of this hour with static and not talking because we were busy having to do something else.
I mentioned the IRS. We, of course, have had the recent IRS scandals and the fact that, in all likelihood, according to the investigating committees of the Congress, the IRS has, some people in it have used their power to suppress speech and to suppress advocacy, usually of the leftwards variety, rather, usually of the conservative variety.
Mm-hmm. And here is a classic example of how the systematic civil disobedience I want has to be very pragmatic. So, for example, the IRS is guilty, I think, of some outrageous abuses of power, such that, for example, I'm kind of assuming I will be audited next year because I wrote this book.
Mm-hmm.
It's a terrible thing to say,
yes.
but it's quite likely I'll be audited. All right. However, civil disobedience with regard to the IRS, I say we can't do that. And the reason we can't do it is that disobedience with regard to the IRS is operationally indistinguishable from wanting to cheat on your taxes. And the fact is that if this systematic civil disobedience is to work, it has to be done in ways which the overwhelming majority of the American people would agree are appropriate if your case came up for a lot of publicity. And if you have a beef with the IRS and you're trying to ignore one of its regulations, you'll never have that overwhelming support.
But this goes back a ways, you know. That is the use, particularly of investigative examination of your past tax returns as a way of intimidating or otherwise controlling what you do publicly. Years ago, I got to know rather well and closely the great political scientist Hans Morgenthau. It was when I came to the University of Chicago. He had been long established there. And in those days, though, he generally had a conservative orientation towards things, towards the rest of the world, and saw the necessity for war as a way of adjudicating certain problems that arise between states. He was, all the same, quite opposed to the Vietnam War and spoke strongly and wrote strongly against it. This was during the term of Lyndon Johnson as president, and he noted, Hans Morgenthau did, that suddenly he was getting audited every year, and it was a very aggressive kind of audit, which took days or even longer and required all sorts of special self-report from him. He was convinced this was being done to shut him up, and of course it did not shut him up. He became all the more expressive and vocal a critic of the Vietnam War. But that's an instance from very far back. That goes back to the 1960s.
You know, I want to emphasize to your listeners that this book is not based on anything specific to the administration of Barack Obama. This, as far as I am concerned, what happened had its roots in 1937 to 43, when a series of very specific Supreme Court decisions with very specific language withdrew a lot of the restraints that the Constitution had placed on governmental action. And in removing those, they forevermore, ineluctably, irreversibly, opened the barn door. So that when Madison talked about the necessity of obliging government to control itself, those obligations to control itself disappeared. And that once that happened, you didn't have an immediate change, but you had a potential for the government to start doing things. And in the 1960s, you started to see that expand. Your case is an illustration of it, and it's been expanding ever since. And what we're looking at now is not a problem created by Democrats or Republicans. It is systemic, and it is pervasive.
And you think it can be stopped, controlled, maybe reversed by an operation like the Madison Fund, as you advocated?
The Madison Fund is a step in the right direction, and it could simply provide a shield whereby people can go about their lives in the same way that they go about their lives, not worrying about whether their houses will burn down, but they have house insurance. And in some ways, I want to start to treat government as an insurable hazard, one that we can have help if the government comes after us. And in the help, you will also have an incentive for the bureaucrats to back off. An analogy I use, Milton, that will give people a sense of what I want Madison Fund to accomplish is this. I want a way to push back so that bureaucrats and the regulatory agencies start to behave like state troopers on interstate highways. The flow of traffic on interstate highways is over the speed limit. I mean, most of us are engaged in civil disobedience on interstates all the time. But the troopers don't enforce the precise speed limit. They go after people who are driving 100 miles an hour or who are driving erratically. That's as it should be. Now, we can't roll back the regulations. We can't repeal a lot of them. All I want is something so simple. I want bureaucrats to use common sense and not to go after people who have done nothing that hurts anybody. Go after people who have violated a regulation in a way that has really caused harm somewhere.
Use moderation instead of falling back upon extremist fanaticism.
Yeah, so that if they have railings that are 40 inches high instead of 42, the guy from OSHA says, "Oh, that's okay. That's close enough." That's all I want, and that all by itself would be such a change in the kinds of barriers that are put up to people.
Well, does the OSHA inspector not? Many of them, don't they say, "Well, that's close enough," or are they all that as rigid as you're suggesting?
Well, I can't speak to whether they all are. I'll tell you what I hear as and read, which is that instead the inspectors, they're supposed to produce results. Okay,
they've got quotas.
They're going out. They're going out, and there are so many regulations that no one inspector knows them all. So you'll talk to business owners, and they'll say, this year we got an inspector who has 30 regulations that he goes to, because those are his set that he looks for. And next year we'll get somebody who has a different 30 set of regulations that are his favorites and that he'll meticulously enforce to the letter, so that when he goes back and files his report about his inspection of Company X, he can say, "Oh yes, I found 4 violations of Company X, for which they'll have to pay $25,000 fines, and I'm doing my job." Yeah, that's the way they act.
We're about to pause for the usual reasons. That's a constraint that all radio talk show hosts abide by. But let me, in advance, say that when we return, I want to give you the Rosenberg theory of the inevitability of constriction and reduction of liberty, the inevitability of government growing too large for its britches and too overbearing and too over-controlling for tolerance on the part of the ordinary citizenry. I shall disclose that to you and ask for your response right after this. And I'm about to disclose, as I say, the Rosenberg theory of the inevitability of this problem. But first, Charles Murray, I want to read one commentary, at least, in response to your book, By the People. This one from Jonah Goldberg, who says, "By the People is a study in contradictions. It is simultaneously depressing and inspiring, technical and profound, infuriating and charming, but always compelling. Charles Murray plays the role of a liberty-loving Lenin, indeed, asking the question, what is to be done? To the end, he offers a practical guide for repairing our broken constitutional order. It is that rarest of books, a populist manifesto grounded in fact and logic." I'm not wearing my reading glasses. That's a little confusion in the reading. What I would argue, and I agree with Goldberg's assessment, but I argue that in a way you are tilting against windmills, or you are facing the inevitable, and we can't overcome the inevitable. What is inevitable, I think, is the expansion of government, and government always expands at some significant cost to those whom it supposedly serves. In a way, Marx and Jefferson both had the same view of the ultimate future of governments. Jefferson tells us that government governs best which governs least, and Marx said ultimately we're going to get governments that don't govern at all. The falling away of the state is going to be the ultimate consequence of the establishment of communism. States do not fall away. They do decline. Civilizations poop out, and then they're replaced by others who go through the same long and cyclic phases, but essentially they involve the restriction of the citizenry and the establishment of more and more power by the elite, which means not only power and preferment in terms of the goods of the world and the ability to kill other people if you so choose, but to make everybody, in some sense, a representation of your will, that is the will of those who run the state, rather than a free acting actor who thinks that things belong to him and freedom belongs to him. Thus, inevitably, we're at maybe close to the tail end of a cycle which will lead to governmental disorder and decline before something new begins the cycle all over again. Have I overstated this too much? Of course I have.
Well, there's a new element in this cycle, and that new element is the information technology revolution.
All right, good. Tell me.
I think that the comparisons with the effects of the Industrial Revolution are not overblown. And let me give you an example in one word, Uber. I know Chicago has Uber because I've used it in Chicago.
Uh-huh.
It has become extremely popular. Who 10 years ago, Milt, 10 years ago would have said, by the way, in 10 years you are going to have a breakup of the monopolies that city councils and taxi companies have created in every major city in the country. And people say, no, you can't do that because, you're never going to get the city council to let you compete. Uber didn't ask for permission. Uber just goes into a city, starts offering its shared rides service that I'm sure most of your listeners are familiar with or have used. And by the time the city council gets its act together and with the taxi monopoly, the service is already so popular that there's a political price to be paid for trying to stop it. This is something we could not have imagined even a few years ago. Airbnb, which is a way of renting rooms from individual homeowners and apartment owners, is another example. There are all sorts of ways in which we don't defeat the government; we simply work around it.
This is not the falling of the state, but the going round the state.
Yeah. So think of the government now as the crazy old objectionable uncle that you have to let live in your apartment, in your spare bedroom.
Yeah.
You can't get rid of him. He's no more pleasant than he ever was, but you can sort of organize your life so he isn't that big a pest. In a way that the government is increasingly becoming that kind of gridlocked, sclerotic, inflexible thing that doesn't really respond very well to problems, that we still have to spend a lot of money on, but we can work around.
But what if you're that fellow whom you mentioned earlier who runs a business and he finds that he's being fined for some silly violation that makes no sense whatsoever, and if he doesn't pay it, they're going to sue him heavily and knock him out of business completely.
And now
the information revolution doesn't really give you any leverage in that situation, does it?
No, but the Madison Fund does. The Madison Fund puts him in a situation whereby he can go to that bureaucrat and say, "Oh, by the way, I should mention to you the Madison Fund is taking my case." And if the Madison Fund has been operating for a matter of years and they have established a track record, all at once the bureaucrat has to lean back and say, "Oh, okay, so they're taking the case. They're going to be piling discovery requests on me. They're going to be having me make court appearances. They are going to be really a pain in the behind for months. Do I really want to take this on?"
Well,
and all at once, my friend has a way to have a very good chance of the bureaucrat saying, "Well, never mind. It could work." But Milt, we and I have been talking for a quarter of a century about various books of mine. I have never been accused by you of being overly optimistic. This is a first. I am actually optimistic that this strategy could do good.
Yes,
could be a step in the right
direction. And the book on those grounds is fascinating, and the ideas are truly fascinating. They do require a lot of money. Where do you get the money to run the Madison Fund. Are you expecting me to make a contribution?
I think that would be a great idea, Bill. The good news here is, well, first I will say something. I presented this idea a couple of years ago when I was just beginning the book to a convention of fellow libertarians and others, and I was saying what we need are some of the very wealthy people who are committed to principal government to contribute money to this. And somebody in the audience got up and said, you don't need the wealthy guys. There are hundreds of thousands or millions of people that would like to contribute to this. And I think that's true, but it could be one of two different things, and maybe a combination of both. Suppose you have one wealthy guy who is a libertarian, lots of them, who contributes $50 million to get the thing started. And once it's started, I think the chances you're going to have millions of smaller contributors who will pitch in their bit. I think the money's there. I think it's really feasible.
By the way, is this in motion already in any sense?
There is. I know of. Oh, let me preface this. I have had people emailing me, telling me to get going on starting this fund. To which I respond, I'm old enough to know what I'm good at and what I'm not good at. I'm pretty good at writing books. I'm not good at starting complex entrepreneurial organizations.
So you go start the fund.
So my work here is done.
Yeah.
I've done but I'm happy to say that I do know of funding of an organization that knows what it's doing to look into the first steps that would be necessary to organize a Madison Fund.
Yeah.
So there are things underway that, and if I had to make a bet, I think it will evolve in ways I can't predict. The actual way that such funds operate will be probably much different from the way I describe it. I think the odds are quite good that such a fund will exist within a matter of a few years.
Well, I think we're on the scene of a true social invention. Institutions sometimes are invented which never actually existed before. There is no exact model, though maybe there are models for this. In fact, what models somehow did you have in mind when you came up with it?
Well,
it clearly wasn't Scientology.
It came to me. No, it did just come to me in the way I described earlier in the program.
Yeah.
I really did envision this mysterious man showing up, and that said, I said, "Gee, what if there were legal aid?" That quickly came to my mind. Legal aid for the poor, which is a nationwide thing. There are legal aid offices all over, and that was the first organization that I said would be a model. You provide legal aid, but it's not to impoverish people. It's to ordinary citizens who are minding their own business and are unwarrantedly being interfered with.
Truly fascinating and exciting.
I really appreciate that.
You were about to say, by the way, what?
Well, there are also legal organizations that have done really good work on a related field. There's the Institute for Justice, the Pacific Legal Foundation, and others, which have taken on selected cases in order to get a judicial decision that is a precedent. For example, there are all of these licensing requirements for occupations. So to be a manicurist, you're supposed to have 250 hours of training or something. It's just ridiculous. And so they challenge those. They sometimes get a favorable decision, and thereafter those cases set a precedent. So those guys have been doing the right kind of thing. My idea is these organizations, which are quite small, with combined budgets of maybe $25 million a year, I'm talking about them on steroids. I'm not talking about dozens of cases a year being brought. I'm talking about thousands of cases a year being brought.
Charles, we're about to pause for the usual reasons, and then we do want to hear from our listeners. So let me quickly invite calls and emails. If you want to call us, the direct phone line is 847-475-1590, 847-475-1590. And for email, and I've got the screen right in front of me, the email address is simply milt, M-I-L-T, at 1590wcgo.com. Milt at 1590wcgo.com. Right back to Charles Murray and to your contributions after this. And directly back to Charles Murray, drawing from his new book, By the People, Rebuilding Liberty without permission. I guess we have been doing this for rather a long time. Every 2 years or so, there's a wonderful new book by Charles Murray.
I think it goes back probably to Losing Ground.
I'm sure it does, or earlier. Emails. Here's some that have come in. The first one is funny, but bitterly so. He says, Milt, have fun being audited along with Dr. Murray next year.
Yeah, I guess you're complicit now, Milt.
Have they come at you in the past?
No.
Has IRS victimized you, for example?
I've never been audited. That's probably a dangerous thing to say, but
It's not.
well, part of the reason is that I submit my taxes in good faith and I follow the rules. I've been a good boy. But,
well, so have I, but so was Hans Morgenthau, I'm sure. But that didn't stop them in that case.
If they decide to come after you, you got no chance.
Yeah. Next email. What does Mr. Murray think of Larry Klayman? A rabble-rouser, sure, but he's always suing the government for something or other.
I'm not familiar with the name. I'm sorry.
Oh, yeah, that's the legal... I forget the name of the organization, but I know them. The Legal Fund for something or other.
Sorry, I can't be responsible.
Yeah. They essentially go after hidden secrets in government and force them open by litigation.
I basically am in favor of just about anything that pushes back against this apparatus. I'm one of those who is scared stiff of the facility out in Utah that's being built that can store everything forever. So I'm in favor of trying to cut into this massive beast wherever possible.
I think you identified this as a libertarian contribution, or libertarian in style, the thought that is, and I guess it is, in that it's arguing for restoring rights that others have taken away from us.
That it is. It's the way I put it in the introduction, the prologue is, this book is for people who are devoted to limited government.
Yeah.
Because that's libertarians, but there are also lots of people who see themselves as conservatives because they're conservative on social issues, but who don't want the government to legislate. They also are devoted to limited government. I refer to us as Madisonians in the book.
Yeah.
Because
thus the Madison Fund. Yes.
Yeah, I essentially have the political philosophy that draws on John Locke, on Adam Smith, on the founders, and I am no more radical than they were.
Quite so. I fully agree. Here's another email. Please ask Murray if he thinks that if he had published the bell curve in 2015 instead of 20 years prior, if he would then have been destroyed by the media. It was bad enough then.
This is very interesting because last year there was a wonderful book called A Troublesome Inheritance, published by the longtime New York Times science writer Nicholas Wade, which in its content was every bit as incendiary or more so than the infamous Chapter 13 in the Bell Curve, which is the chapter that dealt with race differences. And, of course, I was pilloried for discussing race differences in IQ in the book, even though it was a very subsidiary topic. This book, I was absolutely sure, was going to cause a firestorm, was going to force Nicholas Wade into all sorts of terrible situations. Instead, it was pretty much ignored. It's almost as if there's a conspiracy of silence. This was a very important book, and it did not get anything like the attention I thought. So, if the Bell Curve were published today, in one sense, I feel that the violence and anti-free speech violence is worse than it used to be. On the other hand, why did A Troublesome Inheritance get such a silent reception? Very interesting phenomenon.
It surprises me now that you tell me about it.
Yeah. Had you not heard of A Troublesome Inheritance? I gather you probably hadn't.
No.
And I don't blame you for not having heard of it. It was a wonderful book which describes the advances in genetics.
Yeah.
since the decoding of the genome as they relate to our understanding of evolutionary biology and race. I mean, that's about as incendiary as it gets, isn't it? And, well, the fact that you don't know about it when you know about virtually everything that comes out that gets any attention.
Well, virtually everything minus one. Yes.
It speaks volumes. That
I must look for
your
it.
attention.
I must look
it's a
for
great
it.
book.
Yeah. Let me read you another. I see that Jeb Bush is a fan of Charles Murray. What does Murray think of him, or the other GOP candidates?
I've listened to Jeb Bush. I've never met the guy. He seems very attractive as a person. I cannot stand the idea of voting for a Bush in 2016.
You're just against dynasties, is that it?
I really am. If his name weren't Bush, I would probably he would be one of the two or three that I'm most attracted to. Right now, you've got Rubio and Walker and Bush, who I watch with interest, the most interest. But my real candidate for president, a man that I've just devastated did not run, is Mitch Daniels.
Oh, really?
Yeah, but talk about hopeless, quixotic causes. I'm afraid that's never going to be.
Well, he settled for governorship, I guess.
And subsequently, he's president of Purdue University.
Yeah, that's what he is now, yeah.
Just as he did as governor of Indiana.
Well, there are so many people that come to mind as potentially wonderful presidents, except they're gifted with a certain amount of modesty or a certain amount of realism and know that it's a killing job and there's not much to pay for it except easy fame, which you can trade on for millions and billions for the rest of your life.
Of all of the cliches that I think is true is that no one who is willing to do what it takes to run for president is qualified for the office.
Yes, well said indeed. As all of this book is very well said, and I thank you so much for joining us. Let's just make very clear that the title of the book is By the People, Rebuilding Liberty Without Permission. It's published by Crown Forum, and it's been a delight to talk with you again. Thank you so much.
Likewise with you, Milt. Bye-bye.